Hi, I'm Sam Landsman from Slowboat.com.
And I'm Laura Domela from Slowboat.com. Today we're going to be talking about having guests in Alaska.
Having guests aboard is a lot of fun. It's fun to share the experience. It's fun to take them out and see bears and glaciers and whales and all that kind of stuff, especially for people who don't have boats of their own and can't do this on their own.
Yeah, it's great to be able to have people fly in and meet you in a place that's really hard to get to.
Right, but you do have to set some expectations ahead of time. I think that the biggest thing is that even big boats get small really quickly when you're out in the wilderness.
Right. It's not even like RVing where you've got all the land you can get out and explore. You're on a boat, you're floating. There's not often very many places to get off the boat. And the smaller your boat usually means the shorter the list of people that you're probably willing to share the space with for an extended period of time. And a bigger boat with more separation can open up your guest list a bit, but it's still tight quarters.
Yeah, and especially after 3, 4, 5 rainy days, you've been at anchor,
Right.
You've had all your meals together on board. The only way to get off the boat is to go take the dinghy out. And
An even smaller boat.
yeah, so you really have to set expectations and choose who is coming carefully so that you don't end up stuck on the boat with somebody who you really don't want to be with. Some other things to do in advance are remind guests that once you're out away from town, which is where you're probably going to be wanting to spend most of your time, there are no grocery stores or no liquor stores. I've had guests get halfway through a trip and they've drunk all their beer and they say, oh, well, can we go to the liquor store?
Can we pull over?
Yeah, it's 120 miles back to back
Right.
to wherever to get supplies.
Right. And so we'll talk about this later on as well, but it's nice to stock up and
Do some shopping with the guests. Give them the
Before you
opportunity.
go.
Yeah.
Correct.
One other thing that tends to trip some people up, and I know some people who have been upset, is when you don't have an understanding of who's paying for what ahead of time.
Right.
So if you have guests that come up and don't pay for anything, and for some people that's fine, for others that's upsetting. So just one other thing to set the expectations on before you invite friends or get them up to Alaska.
Right. It's also really important to let people know, people who aren't used to being in a small space with limited resources, how to manage power, water, things like that. You don't let the water just run. If somebody offers to do the dishes, unless I know that they know we've got a limited amount of water, I'm a little like, oh no, that's cool, I got it. Because I've seen helpful dishwashers leaving the water just running.
The 40-gallon
Yeah.
dinner.
Yeah.
Explain how to use the head. This is really important, and nothing disrupts a cruise like an unexpected repair of the black water system. So really drive that point home with guests. Make sure that they understand what they can and can't put in the head and how they use it and how they can avoid clogging it or breaking the system. And finally, think about safety. Make sure the guests know where the life jackets are and fire extinguishers, other safety equipment. Make sure they know what to do if you fall overboard as the boat owner or
Right.
captain, and how to get you back, and some basic radio procedures. So have some kind of a safety briefing and make sure the guests are understanding of what they're expected to do and what they might need to do in case of an emergency.
Right. And I find that all of our guests have been super interested in learning more about the boat and boating and how you do stuff. And so that's always pretty fun too.
Yeah, it doesn't have to go to the extent of a full-on mustard drill getting in the
No.
lifeboats, but
No.
you could have some fun with it if you wanted.
Right. Okay. Let's do the man overboard drill again. Okay, let's talk about packing a little bit, because that's the thing that most guests question. What should I bring? What shouldn't I bring? And our boat is a 34-foot boat with no separate stateroom. So there's not a ton of space to store things. And so we always tell people no roller bags.
Yeah, the roller bags are
Yeah.
the nightmare on the
Yeah.
boat. They don't pack down and they take up a huge amount of space, and you end up just moving them from space to space in the boat
Yeah.
to try to keep them out of the way of whatever you're doing
Which
at that
doesn't
time.
really work. So crushable duffel bags are great. I know it's a little trickier to lug them through an airport, but if you can get something that crushes down to stow, it's much better. For clothing, I always tell people you won't need as much as you think, and the layers are great. And merino wool is so good.
Yeah, the merino wool, when it gets wet, it doesn't get cold, and
Right.
it doesn't get stinky like a lot of the synthetics do. It's a little bit more expensive typically, but it's not even itchy like the traditional
No,
wool
it's
garments
great.
are. And you definitely don't need to be bringing formal wear with you, or guests don't need to have formal wear on an Alaska cruise.
Even if you're in town and you go out to dinner, it's
Yeah,
Alaska.
it's all very casual.
Yeah.
No suits or ties or jackets are required. Leave the fancy shoes at home.
Yep.
Rubber boots are much more important.
Yep, rubber boots and waterproof outer layers are really good. Having a pair of rain pants along with a waterproof jacket is great. great for dinghy rides in the rain because it'll be raining.
Yep, and one of the joys of getting out to Alaska is being able to go outside and take a dinghy ride up to a glacier or up to a bear, and just because it's raining doesn't mean you shouldn't go. So having the appropriate clothing makes that trip a lot more enjoyable. Finally, don't be hesitant to ask guests to bring things that you might need. I've had guests fly up alternator and various heater parts and all sorts of things over the years, and I figure if they're coming from Seattle to spend time on my boat, the least they can do is bring a part.
Yeah, you just ship it to them.
That'll make it easier.
Right, we just ship it to them beforehand, and
yeah, it doesn't cost them any money. Just throw it in their suitcase with everything else, and often a more reliable way of getting things than trying to wait for parts to be shipped up.
Because you know when the guest is going to arrive.
Exactly.
You've had summers where you have had a lot of guests in a row.
Yeah, it kind of feels like I've been running a B&B at times.
Such a tour guide.
Race into Juneau to drop off one group after 4 or 5 nights. I might have a day to turn the boat around, do the laundry, fix whatever's broken, go grocery shopping, get a little rest, and the next set of guests flies in. And that can get kind of tiring over the course of a whole summer. It's fun for a little while.
Yeah, so it is still kind of a vacation for you and a vacation for them, but it is a lot of work. And so it's nice to leave yourself a little break in between guests.
And I found that guests all want to see the same 3 things, basically. They want to
Yeah.
see glaciers, they want to see bears, and they want to see whales.
Yep.
And don't get me wrong, I love seeing all these things, but it can get a little repetitive, especially when the guests are coming for a short 4 or 5 day trip. I end up doing the same itinerary over and over, which is great and fun. You know, they're beautiful places, but it limits the amount of time to go exploring exploring the new places.
So having your guests fly into you've got cities in quotes. These are not really cities, but bigger hubs for flights are Ketchikan, Sitka, and Juneau. And so it's good to plan to have your guests fly in or out of.
Right. The advantage of these 3 is they have the most services. They have supermarkets, drugstores, and everything that you'd probably need in terms of services.
Right.
The biggest advantage is they have 2 airlines that fly from the lower 48. And so you can fly on Alaska or Delta from Seattle. So it's quite a bit cheaper than flying into towns like Wrangell or Petersburg or Gustavus, where Alaska Airlines is the only airline.
Right. Last year, we had some friends fly into Gustavus instead of Juneau, and I think it was about $100 more per person for that.
And then we'll talk more about some other options for getting people last minute into smaller places that aren't terribly expensive. One fun thing about Ketchikan while we're on here is the airport is on an island across from town, and there's a ferry that goes across, but you can also take your dinghy or your boat to the airport.
Yeah.
And so last year, I think we dropped off Kevin at the airport by dinghy.
Yeah, that was great.
And it was a pretty novel way to get to the airport. You don't even have to hear them telling you to keep circling the airport drive. You just tie up your dinghy and walk up to the airport. I like spending the first night and the last night in port. There are several reasons for this. For one thing, it really helps ease the transition. Anything that people forgot along the way or they didn't bring with them when they flew up, they can remember, and after a night on the boat, they might, I forgot a toothbrush, or I forgot whatever.
Can we run to the
be.
store this morning before we take off?
And once you leave, you probably won't be near any store. So it's good for that. And also, it's a great time to eat out. You'll be cooking aboard
a lot.
All the time. You'll have a lot of dishes.
Yeah.
It's nice to let somebody else do the cooking and dishes when you're in port.
Also, before the guests go home, it's kind of a cool come back, shower, go out to dinner, wander the town a little bit, and then their flight's the next morning. It's just a nice calm. You're not rushing to get back for a flight or anything. Yeah,
you're not sitting there thinking, the current's running a little bit stronger than I expected, the wrong direction.
Right.
I'm looking at the watch. Am I going to make it to the airport in time? It's just a lot less stressful when you have an extra night built in on each side.
Also, it's nice to have guests fly into one port and out of another instead of in and out of the same place, like into Sitka and out of Juneau or vice versa. And if somebody's flying in and out of one town, I would say Juneau's probably the best for that because there's a lot close by that you can do in a short period of time.
Juneau's good for that. If you're willing to spend a little bit more money, Petersburg is also great for that. LeConte Glacier is a day trip away, so Petersburg can actually be a great option if you have people who don't want to stay on the boat with you, but you want to give them a taste of Alaska. You can day trip to a Tidewater Glacier and go day tripping out in Frederick Sound and probably see humpback whales.
Right.
You can even do a commercial trip down to Annan Bear Observatory in the summer during the season from July until August, and you could get a good chance at seeing a bear.
That's close enough also to the Stikine River to do some of those Stikine River trips in those little jet boats, which is super fun.
That's one option. The thing that I like about the point-to-point trips is you don't have to do any backtracking.
Yeah, it's all new stuff.
If you say start in Juneau and end in Sitka, can see new things every day. You just have a little more flexibility than if you have to rush back into Juneau. Which is another topic that is important. You want to make sure you build in some flexibility with your schedule. Weather happens and breakdowns happen and who knows what else might happen, but plan to have a couple of nights in the same acreage at some point.
Yeah, you can always change it.
Right, you can always move on more quickly if you want, or you can show up late, but you have a couple of nights.
Yeah.
And I like planning half-day cruises. This allows some time to go exploring once you get to an anchorage, but it also allows you to double up on those days if you need to. So if you've gotten stuck because of weather or mechanical issue,
and you have a half-day cruise planned the next day, you can make it a full-day cruise.
Right, and then you're back onto your schedule that you wanted to be on. But there's nothing that ruins time with guests like having too rushed a schedule and just charging through every day, 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, being underway, and not actually getting to really experience Alaska.
Let's talk also about the small plane option.
Yeah, the small planes fly out of all the towns and cities along the way, and they fly to many really tiny towns.
Yeah.
They fly to Gustavus and Elfin Cove and Pelican and Angoon and any number of other places. And it's a great way to connect people without having to go into the big city. And I like doing it on one end of their trip. So maybe you pick them up in Juneau and then you drop them off in Elfin Cove after going to Glacier Bay.
And they take a little float plane back to where?
They take the float plane back to wherever their commercial flight is out of. And so the great benefit of this is they don't require much notice. So you can book normally the day before, the day of even. Mm-hmm. If they're scheduled service, which there's a ton of scheduled service, the fares are pretty reasonable, $100 to $150 each way normally.
And then they get a scenic float plane ride.
And so
nice.
I've used it when, for example, I didn't get back to town as quickly as I thought I did, and the guests already had an Alaska Airlines flight scheduled, and then they needed to meet me where I was. The planes move a lot faster than the boat, so rather than a 10-hour or 12-hour slog back into town, it's a 20-minute flight for them to meet the boat.
And the only issue with that is weather can mess up the schedule.
Yeah.
You might have your guests for an extra few days.
It's not uncommon for the small planes or flying visual flight rules. The fog moves in or the rain is coming down heavily, they just can't fly safely. And so it's not uncommon for those flights to be canceled. Another option to get into some of the smaller places is the Alaska Marine Highway System.
The ferries.
Southeast Alaska has no road links between most of the communities. They rely on the ferry service. And there's a fast ferry that is not terribly reliable, but seems to be working at least half the time. And it connects Sitka and Juneau in about 4.5 hours.
That's amazing.
Even if your guest has a round trip flight out of Juneau or out of Sitka, you can do the point to point and then they can hop on the fast ferry. I think it's about $60 or $70 one way.
That's not bad.
4.5 hours. It's a scenic trip. It connects the two towns pretty easily. The downside in Juneau, it goes into Auk Bay. They have to take a taxi into town, but it's not a big deal.
It's not terrible. So why is it so unreliable? What's the deal?
Well, this past fall, I saw it being towed through Elliott Bay right in front of Seattle and towed it all the way down the Inside Passage.
There's only one?
Yeah, there's only one.
Okay.
It's water jet powered, and it's called the Fairweather. It's about 250 feet long, I think. And they seem to be sucking logs up into it. The logs don't play nicely with the water jets.
No.
And I think that I read at some point they broke the ferry in really rough seas in Lynn Canal one winter. Literally, the hull was failing, apparently.
Huh. So then they just don't have a ferry anymore between Sitka and Juneau?
Yeah, for that time. They have a slow ferry that still runs.
But
How
slow is the slow ferry?
I think they're more like 12 or 14 hours.
Okay.
And they have some really inconvenient times. Some of the departures are like 2 a.m. And the benefit of that is you are allowed to camp out on deck, so you can bring your tent with you and pitch a tent. And while we're on this subject, actually, it's worth pointing out that you can ride the Alaska Marine Highway all the way from Bellingham, Washington. So if you have guests that are looking for kind of an alternative way to get to Alaska, or they don't like flying, they can take the ferry all the way from Bellingham, and it's a couple of day trip up the Inside Passage, and
that's kind of cool.
Meet you somewhere along the way.
So why not Canada? We're talking about having guests in Alaska. What if your guests want to see BC?
Well, there are a few problems in Canada, and this is from a U.S. perspective. So if you're Canadian and you're flying out of Canada, this is slightly different. But for Americans going into Canada, then it's an international flight. So you have a passport that you have to deal with, you have the border control and all that. But the real problem, I think, for American visitors is there's no inexpensive plane service into Canada. So up through, say, the Broughtons, you can fly pretty frequently on like Kenmore Air, but it's very expensive. It's several $100s each way per person for a pretty short flight. So it's normally much cheaper to fly into Alaska on a 737 than it is to fly into somewhere in the Broughtons on a
small
full plane.
Right.
And then once you get north of the Broughtons, north of Vancouver Island, your options become even fewer. I've had people fly in and out of Shearwater, Bella Bella. That works pretty well. That goes down to Vancouver, but then you have to connect in Vancouver somewhere. And then you're on an international flight and it gets more complicated.
Also, no glaciers.
Yes, that's a big one. The
And
glaciers.
BC's beautiful, but you'll see bears, you'll see whales, but no glaciers.
But the southernmost tidewater glacier in the northern hemisphere is in southeast Alaska at LeConte Glacier near Petersburg. And so the glaciers are a huge draw. I think they're just magical. And it's one of the things that keeps me going back to Alaska. Well, thanks for listening. Appreciate spending the time with us. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write us or post comments below.
And thanks for joining us. To see more of our educational boating videos, subscribe to our Slowboat YouTube channel. If you're on Facebook, you can follow us at facebook.com/slowboatlife. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at slowboatlife. And of course, you can always find us on slowboat.com. Until next time, see you on the water.